Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the second panel of today, entitled Navigating a New Era for Great Power Politics. Our panelists joining us for this discussion are Christina Chen, a research fellow at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research in Taiwan, Theresa Fallon, the founder and director of the Center for Russia-Asia Studies, Center for Russia-Europe-Asia Studies here in Brussels, Shairee Malhotra, an associate fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in India, and our moderator is Tomi Huhtanen, the executive director of the Martin Center. We'll also be joined by MEP Andreas Schwab shortly. Thank you.
Good. So hello everybody and welcome back to our discussion and our second panel of the day, and I have to say a very exciting topic. I'm so happy I had it. Navigating a new era for great power politics. So basically, as an introduction, we just have to go back some minutes when President Surinda made the introduction. So world is shifting very clearly. We could make an argument that the world is moving to word of order to disorder. Basic concept and global concept which has been operating are being questioned. We have Russia, we have China, who are playing since several years very assertive and strong role. On the other hand, already in last panel we spoke about global south, and of course the Western powers, European, US are trying to adapt. So, okay, they already introduced the speakers, which we have a really excellent set. So, just to repeat, so Christina Chen is a research fellow at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research from Taiwan. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So, sorry for your trouble with the luggage, but you made it, so we much appreciate that. We have Shairee Malhotra, is Associate Fellow for Strategic Studies Program at India's leading think tank, Observer Research Foundation, ORF, which has a big annual meeting next week in Delhi. We have Theresa Fallon, is the founder and director of the Center for Russia-Europe-Asia Studies here in Brussels, very well-known personality. You know, if you earn this business, you know Theresa from various panels and inputs. And then we have Andreas Schwab, who is just, I guess, being micked outside. He's a senior MEP from German MEP, commenting on those issues. So, you know, the challenge here is the topic is wide. We have great speakers, and so the challenge is really to play how we play with the time. So let's start with India, with Shairee. So for the introduction, so you know, on all these developments now, especially now when from European view or perspective, when there is the question about China, and we spoke about China Plus and all that, you know, the eyes are really on the biggest democracy of the planet, which is India. But the question really, what we are asking, how India is seeing itself, how it's seeing its global role on this changing dynamics, its relations to global south, what role it will have, and how India wants this whole setting to be in the future. Shairee.
Well, thank you, Tomi, for your question. Thank you to the Martin Center for inviting me to speak on this very interesting panel. Well, Tomi, I would start by saying that in terms of Indian foreign policy, there are two main practices that really underline and guide India's strategic vision today. The first one is the practice of strategic autonomy, and this is in fact something that India has practiced ever since its independence, in fact. And the second is this doctrine of multi-alignment. And I would say that this doctrine of multi-alignment is really some sort of evolution of India's non-alignment policy that guided Indian foreign policy back in the days post-independence during the Cold War. And multi-alignment is in some ways a sort of new iteration of non-alignment. In quite simple terms, I would say multi-alignment really refers to a policy of engagement in multiple multilateral forums, the use of diverse global partnerships, and the goal of this is to attain the many objectives of Indian foreign policy and really to further India's own national interest. But I will disagree as well when people compare multi-alignment to non-alignment, because I think the big difference between these two doctrines is the fact that multi-alignment conveys a very strong sense of active participation and engagement, whereas non-alignment was more of a reactive policy. So in practical terms, what does this actually mean? This means that today India is part of multiple groupings, the Quad, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but it's also part of minilateral formats, such as the trilaterals that India has with countries like Australia and Japan. And this also means in practical terms that India maintains close ties with a whole range of nations, many of which often don't get along with each other. And the most obvious case would, of course, be Russia and the West, with whom India's partnerships have recently expanded. India is also one of the few countries that is probably not so concerned with a Trump return in the White House. And this, I suppose, speaks for the strength and the sort of balancing act that India plays in foreign policy. And really what drives some of India's choices today in the strategic realm is the fact that India has a status as a middle power. In the international system today. It aspires for a multipolar world which will provide it with greater options, which is free from constraints, and which allows India to sort of maximize its gains. And I would say that, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar really summed up this approach very well when he said, "This is a time for us to engage America, manage China, cultivate Europe, reassure Russia, bring Japan into play, draw neighbors in, extend the neighborhood, and expand traditional constituencies of support." So,
for each place, the separate content. But Shairee, one question, but in practice, what does it mean for US and Europe? Because they automatically reflect, okay, India is a democracy, they are our allies, but in this changing world where you have conflicts and tensions, what does it mean for the West? Is India allies, or it depends, or, how does it balance out? How we should approach you?
I think it depends very much on circumstances, and it depends very much probably on the policy area in question as well. Yeah. So if you look at, like I said, India's relationships with the West have expanded significantly in the last 2 to 3 years. And this has somewhat happened in parallel to China's rise and China's, sort of expansionist and very assertive behavior, which, this asymmetry of power that India and China does favor China both economically and militarily. And this has probably been a big factor, I would say, in the EU-India strategic partnership as well, which I would say has significantly expanded since 2020. So in 2020, India went through this Galwan Valley clash when China had attacked India brutally at its borders. And at the same time, Europe was also in parallel going through its own disillusionment with China that started during the pandemic period when China was weaponizing supply chains. So I would say that the China factor looms large, both in India's calculations with the United States, as well as the EU and its member states, but also with countries like Australia, with whom India's partnerships have expanded.
Great, thanks. Let's go back then later to this whole India-China relationship, which is very, very interesting. But now I would turn to Christina. So when we speak about global politics, power politics, of course, the eyes are on India, but specifically it's between Taiwan and China. And so how do you see this changing dynamics is impacting to that situation, and what are the perspectives? How do you see the situation developing between China and Taiwan, and what role, for example, Europe should play?
Tomi, thank you for the question. And Shairee pointed out that the China factor, and indeed it is true that the world is becoming more and more full of conflicts and tensions. And one of the hot points or flashpoints in the world is the Taiwan Strait. And indeed, it's really between China and Taiwan that is the source of the conflict. And I would like just to start by talking about how over the time we're seeing China becoming more and more aggressive. And this is because ever since Xi Jinping, he came to power, which occurred in 2012. So that was a long time ago, more than 10 years ago. He has this ambition of not just having his eyes on the Taiwan Strait, but he's proposing to change the global order. So he's talking about this rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, or he even touted this concept of the East is rising and the West is declining. And I think at the time, people didn't really pay that much of attention. They thought it was more of a slogan. But I think over the time, when we saw the Xi Jinping and the CCP modernizing the PLA, the Chinese military, and expanding the military, and also having a lot of, in the beginning we called them assertiveness, but then, I think recently people started to use the term aggression, aggressiveness, not just in the Taiwan Strait, but also in the South China Sea, and also, elsewhere. So we're seeing a lot of the behaviors from China that are really posing threat to the Taiwan Strait and situation also to elsewhere. So in terms of Taiwan, I think what we're seeing is China not only conducting military drills, which occurred twice, right? Once in 2022 after the ex-House Speaker from U.S. Pelosi visited Taiwan. It was one of the largest military drill conducted by China, and then we realized that China was considering having a naval blockade against Taiwan, which would be very, very serious. It will have a serious consequence if that happened. And a year afterward, when the then Vice President Lai Ching-te, he visited United States, China conducted another large-scale military drill. But besides that, we're also seeing China increasing its so-called hybrid warfare on Taiwan. So we're talking about this constant daily harassment from the China, the warplanes, the ships, harassing Taiwan and then flying across the ADIZ, the median line. We're also seeing, disinformation campaign conducted on a daily basis, and also, cyber attacks on Taiwan. So these things also are something that Taiwan is exposed to on a daily basis. So not just the traditional kind of military threat, but also these non-traditional kinds of military threats are conducted on Taiwan. And also talked about the South China Sea area. The Philippines have been stepping up their efforts, because they realize that China is not just building artificial islands in the region. China is actually using its ships to harass their fishermen and to also to pose threat there. So I think given the current situation, I want to emphasize that even though it seems that after APEC meeting, the United States and China seem to be on a kind of the less of attention, and the tension has decreased. And Xi Jinping kept talking about, no, we don't have intention to invade Taiwan. It's not our intention. We don't have a timeline. I would say, don't believe in that, because for China, for Xi Jinping, he's always thinking about, reunifying Taiwan. It's just a matter of time for him.
Okay, so that's, very short. So what does it, just next 5-10 years? Because we were describing how the tension was building up, things are getting worse. So how do you see this develop? What do you think?
Well, people often wonder if there's a deadline, 2027, 2025. They like to think about in that aspect. But our assessment is that even though the PLA does not have the capability, and given what happened domestically, Xi Jinping purging the top PLA officials, so that kind of decrease, that shows that Xi Jinping does not have the confidence yet in the military's ability to conduct such kind of a large-scale conflict, which is kind of reassuring. But I would still say that the PLA is still very aggressively expanding its capabilities. He hasn't really given up that yet. And I think Xi Jinping, he does have in his mind that he wants to make Taiwan unification his legacy. That's his project. He wants to do it, in his term. And now he's almost like a dictator now. So, he can do whatever he wants. He does not have any real checks and balances in China. So I think the concern is that, yes, it does not have that capability yet. But what if Xi Jinping, one day he wakes up and thinks.
Yeah, has like a Putin moment.
Yeah.
Putin moment. Okay, the interesting discussion. We'll come back to that. But Theresa, okay, we already spoke about China, but as your Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. So how do you see that the China and Russia dynamics playing? Because of course we Europeans want to see this is very much linked. I don't know if that view is so much shared outside the West. So how do you see the dynamics, especially looking now at the development in Asia? So how is that going along? Theresa, what would you say?
Thank you, Tomi, for that great question. And first of all, I want to say it's such an honor to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to Tomi, Peter. The initial event of this conference, I hope you'll continue it year after year. So it's a real honor, and I'm so glad all of you have turned out on a terribly rainy day, and happy Valentine's Day. So of course, this is a good hook for Europe, because we see all across Europe a mixed view. It's not even geographically noted how people see Russia-China strategic convergence. Some countries in Central Eastern Europe don't see this connection. Some are more pro-Russia, some are more pro-China, some want to see a division between Russia and China. But I think one of the most interesting recent developments in the region is that what has happened in North Korea. So we saw President Putin have a meeting with Kim Jong-un, and this demonstrates how these two theaters are definitely connected. So South Korea sends more armaments to Ukraine than all EU member states combined. North Korea is now sending armaments to Russia to fight in Ukraine. So who would have dreamt that North and South Korea would have such an impact on a war taking place in Ukraine? So we know from history, North Korea has always tried to, it's a small country, it tries to play off the great powers. So their neighbor, Russia and China, they're sandwiched between the two, and they try to play them off one another. But China always likes to pretend they don't have any influence on North Korea. But Chinese have told me in meetings that, yeah, this is great. We like North Korea because when they shoot a missile, it kind of creates a bit of chaos, and our fingers are off of that. So they kind of, a structural function, they serve a purpose for some of China's strategy. But in this instance, I would argue that it's actually backfiring. So you had the Kim Jong-un, he only can travel by train. They met in Vladivostok. And this, I think, made Xi Jinping a bit nervous, because after the summits, he hasn't been meeting with Kim Jong-un. The relationship has been a bit more frosty. And so Putin is kind of playing this off and making Xi a bit more nervous. So is this a new triangle of Russia, China, and North Korea? Obviously, they can play each other off. This is going to force Beijing to be a little more nice to Kim Jong-un. And this is an important year in the relationship because it's the 75th anniversary of relations with Beijing's relations with the Kremlin and with North Korea. So Kim Jong-un is going to go on a visit to Beijing, and I suspect we'll see a bit of a warmer relationship between China and North Korea. And Putin will try to use this to his advantage. Will this become more coherent? Will it become more strong? We'll have to be watching that. But everyone's watching also for a contingency. What if North Korea, which is also decoupling its relations from South Korea, it's announced that they're no longer trying to be brotherly and having this great relationship. So that really set off alarm waves in the region. And because there are about 25 to 35,000 US troops in South Korea, if anything should happen there, and there was an action in Taiwan, those troops would be pinned down. So that's what think tankers do. We always think of the doom and gloom, worst case scenarios, but please God, that won't happen. But we have to think about these possible contingencies. The other issue is the more that North Korea misbehaves and shoots missiles, it makes Japan and South Korea very neuralgic, and they want to spend more money on their defense. And this is not in Beijing's interest. So this can also have a negative implication for Beijing. So on the other hand, if we look at the other triangle, we see really incredibly good relations between Japan and South Korea, who have traditionally, tensions from their past history. But because of this region is becoming much more unstable, we're seeing unprecedented cooperation between Japan, South Korea, and even the US. So that's another interesting triangle in the region.
Thank you, Theresa. I would go back to the China-Russia relations, because at least here in the West we have this, you could make an argument that actually for Russia, in the long term, actually China is much bigger threat than the West will ever, be, because of the various factors. But is that dynamics? Is Russia playing very much a short-term game, and this, long-term possible threat maybe in distant future is just overseen, or how is that playing at is there reservations in your view?
It's really interesting. China kind of portrays, or we saw the New Year phone call between Putin and Xi Jinping. That was the first call. So it's clear that it's a top priority for Beijing to be in touch with Russia. And on the website of the Chinese mission, it's only written in Chinese. It's not written in English. So they want to downplay this kind of phone call and these special relationships. They tell different audiences, different things, but it's not too hard to find out, what's going on. Wang Yi also had a call with his Russian counterpart, and the premier also had a call. So all of this happened for the new year. It's a sign that this is really their top priority. So China pays a big price for this in Europe, because some European leaders see China-Russia convergence. China, remember this time last year at the Munich Security Conference, which is coming up in a few days, the Chinese had their political settlement. Journalists called it the peace plan, but that's not really what the Chinese even called it. It was a 12-point plan. The 12th point was to help rebuild Ukraine so that Chinese could get contracts. So it's not really quite a peace plan. We've seen, now we're starting the third year of the war. The High Representative Joseph Borrell constantly says, only China can, be the interlocutor here. We really haven't seen them do much, right? There's growing evidence of dual-use goods being sold to Russia from China. These red lines are a bit elastic. So I think that nobody wants to contemplate how difficult that could be, that if everyone wants to play along because China could make things worse. I had an opportunity to ask Joseph Borrell at a conference, and he said, well, we always ask them for their help because they could sell much more lethal weapons. So this is kind of wishful thinking or wish casting, but I think that it's clear that the evidence is mounting that China-Russia cooperation and strategic convergence. Nevertheless, Putin can be an irritant with China. Even, let's face it, in transatlantic relations, we have an alliance, but there are irritants. So China and Russia do not have an alliance, but there are clearly irritants in the relationship. And I think Putin also doesn't want people to think he is Xi Jinping's vassal. So sometimes he does things that could be irritating. But my analysis is that China has made the decision it is better to have Russia in the tent than outside of it.
Yeah, and you can make an argument that they are patient to wait, that Russia is in collapse and they have time. Andreas Schwab, welcome. We earlier in this conference we discussed, so it's about the changing power balances, global south, the new powers rising up. You heard the discussion. So the question is, what does it mean for Europe, for European Union? How shall we position that, on this? And yesterday we had discussion where we made the point that actually also here in Brussels we tell ourselves that we are very international, but in fact we are very domestic, in the sense that we speak about European issues actually, and this has been noted by, by various commentators that since the last 10 years. But in this changing world, what should we do? How shall we approach the issue and how to position ourselves? Andreas.
Well, this is a very good start because you were introducing this with a certain reference to local stuff. And today there is not only Valentine's Day, but there is also the end of Carnival in Germany. And therefore there is plenty of discussions now or meetings to be very tough with the political adversary and to be outspoken. So I think at that conference we should be very precise and very positive and not that much outspoken as in the beer cells and the beer factories in Germany. But I will go there. So I'm already a bit in that mood, and I try to moderate my intervention for this. I think that we are, to a certain extent, seeing the end of the economic large freedom that we have been experiencing, that has also brought Europe a high growth rate in the last 50 years, also to China, also to the US. This globalization that was only focusing on prices and on supply is now getting a third element, which is the strategic choices that economies, jurisdictions have to take to make sure that the future remains in their own hands. Yeah. And for that reason, it was the right choice of the Commission to go for this approach of decoupling, de-risking, which is the better option for sure, because decoupling to a certain extent we cannot even do, but that we have a very clear view on how we can get reduced the risks that we are running with supplying only from specific countries. And I would say that to a certain extent, the development that this supply was so one-sided at a certain moment in time, at the end of a certain period, has not always been a strategic choice. It has also been a consequence of prices and workforce available and so on and so forth. But we have to face today that the long-term economic impact of these risks are too high. Now, saying that we should try to de-risk the European economy is one basic reflection, but the big consequence or the big question behind this is how to do this. Because we don't want to fall into a planning economy where the European Union or member states are telling to companies what they are allowed to do and what they are not allowed to do. Mm-hmm. And our big problem will be, especially in the context of these Green Deal policies, to make sure that we can move on, that we can achieve our goals, but at the same time have a different supply with sometimes much higher costs. And for us as a very strong economy, this is a key concern. But if you look, for example, I would say to Asia, we have been in Singapore and in South Korea and in Japan last year. The concern is a bit dependent on their relation to China. It's not what they feel as we do feel it in Europe. If you go to South America, they are even more relaxed because they don't feel that strong participation pressure of globalization as we do here. And therefore, we have to elaborate much more deeply the strategy for the European Union on how to make this de-risking an economic reality. Mm-hmm. And I believe that we cannot do it only in between 27 member states. It has to be a larger alliance with other Western states. And to have that in the end as a good result, to make it happen, we need also better tools to discuss about how to achieve it. Because our American friends that have a very strong view on this as well, they prefer to do it as it happens, as there is a majority in Congress and as it's needed. And they don't care that much about the needs of their Western allies. But for us, it will be very much important that we can do that based on a common strategy. As, for example, we try to do in the CHIPS Act, in the development of independent CHIPS channels, but there would be plenty of other examples to speak about. My experience from the digital policy area is that the Americans, when we push them into the right direction, they are able to do so, but we have to invest a lot and we have to show unity on it. And secondly, that's the other part of the story, de-risking doesn't mean that we keep China completely out of our economic activity, but it's to our Chinese actors to prove that they are part of open markets and a transparent supply system. And we can only achieve this if our European companies that want to be supplied ask the same questions and that there is no mismatch between policies and economic actors. And I think on that we have now a draft, but we will have to work it out much more precisely, and we will have to make sure that the economic operators really follow and invest themselves into that strategy.
And as a follow-up to that, so what is the kind of the mainstream should be, because we see, you know, certain amount of, or you can make an argument, we have kind of deglobalization, regionalization of globalization. So should we as a European Union should be kind of fiercely defend the trade deals and push that avenue? Or of course the one big issue for the crisis or challenge what we have is war in Ukraine, which has global implications. Does it, is our having stronger military capabilities, maybe even globally, prerequisite for in order to us to maintain our global position, or should we work, I don't know, much more, okay, within the EU framework, but also in bilateral relations? So where is the accent?
Well, I think the basic value that the European Union wants to defend is freedom. And what has happened in the last 5, 6, 7 years is that, unfortunately, we have been having a variety of values that have been all brought together and messed up to a certain extent. And if you watch, for example, to South America, we should focus on our key value first of all. And therefore, on countries like Argentina, Brazil, and others, I do still believe that the German saying Wandel durch Handel, so trade improving talks and understanding, is still valuable. We have been putting at first in some of the trade talks that we had there specific Green Deal observations that had really nothing to do and that we never were able to implement, because if the Brazilians don't care about their rainforest themselves, no one will care, so it's their own responsibility. But in a larger worldwide context, I think definitely we have to focus on freedom, and they are generally our allies on that, and we have more to watch on this basic value before going into other details that in trade talks matter but cannot be over-dominant. I think that this has been a shortcoming of the last years, but it's never too late, because we haven't unfortunately been able to sign that many trade agreements. I think there is a chance for the European Union, but also for the West, for the Western world, to manage again, to be more focused on the key drivers of our activity, and then putting at second and third range other elements that are important as well, but that have to be defended as well locally.
Thank you. Good, we are already running more than half time of this panel, so it's up to you. I open the discussion, and for comments, please keep it short, not so opinionated, but rather focused on questions. So so you have 1, 2, and then you have there in the corner. So, yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Please introduce yourself.
Yes, Alberto Turkstra from Diplomatic World. Short question to Shairee. You mentioned the burgeoning ties between India and Russia. So how do you assess the so-called special and privileged strategic partnership between the Russian Federation and India in light of the events of the last 2 years? Thank you.
All right, that sounds very good. So there's one, there is second. Tricky with the mics, I know. So.
Yeah. Andrea Castagna. I have a number of affiliations, but I'm here today in my personal capacity. And thank you so much for this discussion about great powers. But I was a bit surprised. Today we're talking about different elephants in the room. And I think that one big elephant was not mentioned. You, Mr. Fallon, were mentioning North Korea as one of the bigger suppliers of Russia. But the other one is...
Please, let's try to keep it on question. If you go to the question, please.
I'm coming to a question.
All right, great.
The other one was Iran, because it seems to me that Iran poses multiple threats to the global security, coming from drones in Russia to the Red Sea, as well as in Israel. So it seems to me that it's a big topic that was not addressed. Where Iran stands in this equation of great power politics?
All right, good. So do you have there, as you see the hand, and there. So there we have already 4 questions, and then we go back to panel. So keep it short.
Sure, I will do my best. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for this panel. Really interesting. I'm Roberto Talenti. I'm a doctoral researcher in climate governance. So yeah, you can guess maybe from what I do what's going to be my question about. Actually, it's really about elephants in the room. As we are talking about a new era for great power politics, I would like to know which is the role, basically, in the strategic plans of all these great powers we're talking about, of climate change and of climate diplomacy. Because, I mean, I didn't hear about a lot from, that side, but I know for sure that this is going to affect a lot human and hard security in terms of global migration, food insecurity, water security, So I would like to know, how does this issue of climate diplomacy, climate strategy fits into the strategic plans of the different new powers we are talking about today? Thank you.
Climate diplomacy, and then final short question there, and then we go to the panel.
Yeah, hello. I'm leading up to my question, shall be very short. I think I have the impression that everything is still terribly fragmented and disconnected. When I look at the title of this conference, Global Synergy, this sounds a bit surrealistic. I was invited some time ago to attend a meeting.
Can you set to the question, please?
Yeah, well, I was about to say that I received, that I attended a meeting at the Royal Academy of Sciences, where I attended a lecture given by Professor Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize winner in economics. And I asked a question to Professor Amartya Sen. If world society, well-being, quality of life could become an international referential, a fundamental changing the world mindset, could this not serve as a strong incentive to catalyze the blending of all the disconnected and fragmented action plans and roadmaps together? And he said it definitely could. So I'm wondering if the blockage to global synergy is perhaps a mindset issue and not just an economic issue. Thank you.
Mindset. Good. All right, we go to panel. So maybe start from the India, Rasa.
Yeah, okay, so the question on Russia-India relations, right? So, Russia is a long-standing traditional partner for India since decades. But as I mentioned in my previous comments, India's ties with the West have expanded in recent years. And Russia's actions in the last 2 years have, I would say, created some problems for India. When the Russia-Ukraine war began, India was under a lot of pressure to explicitly condemn Russia, to sort of choose sides. But given its own security compulsions, this was rather difficult for India to do. And I would say that there are perhaps 3 or 4 main reasons as to why Russia still continues to be an important partner for India. The first one is, of course, the historic dependence that India has on Russia when it comes to military equipment and arms supplies. And India is diversifying its defense partnerships now, so it is no longer only dependent on Russia. It's now importing weapons from France, which has emerged as India's largest strongest defense partner, in fact, also Israel and the United States. But the issue is that Russia is still the easiest partner for India to deal with in terms of getting technologies, in terms of, less conditions attached when it comes to acquiring weapons. The second very important factor is, as Theresa mentioned as well, the Russia-China partnership and the no-limits partnership that was signed just before Russia invaded Ukraine. And this has very serious implications for India, given India's own very tense relations with China at the moment. So India, by keeping Russia close, even in today's time, wants to prevent a closer Russian-Chinese embrace. But it's also important for India to prevent an alignment of Pakistan and Russia, which, as you know, is India's sort of traditional foe when it comes to international relations. And the third important point is that India, as I mentioned, practices this multi-aligned foreign policy. And in this context, India aspires to have a multipolar world, which allows it to exercise its options more freely. And it views itself and Russia as well as an important pole in this whole multipolar order. In terms of the future of this relationship, I think this is a partnership that is rather one-dimensional, because the traditional focus is on things like weapons. There is a lack of an economic dimension when it comes to India's ties with Russia. And if you compare this to India's relationships with the West, with the United States, with the EU and its member states, these are relationships that are much more multifaceted. They involve trade ties, technology ties, and also very significant people-to-people ties. So the future of the relationship is, I would say, very much under question. And I think this would also depend on what kind of power Russia would actually be in the future itself. So, but for now, I think this is a relationship that will probably continue to stay strong.
Okay, Shairee, thank you. And maybe on the question on Iran, I don't know if you can.
Okay. Well, I'm with the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies, and I already cover a lot, but I have had to cover Iran as well on this situation, so I'm happy to grab it. Is this a proxy war? We see China is losing money because ships would go through the Red Sea. They have, on our way now to Europe, is a RoRo, so a roll-on, roll-off ship just to bring BYD electric vehicles to Europe. It's going around the Cape of Good Hope, and it should be arriving in European ports very soon. So we don't know if Europe will be able to get their sanctions package through, or we'll see what happens with that. But what happened there? Everyone is getting crisis fatigue. The war in Ukraine, now we have this crisis in the Red Sea. Will this spill over into a larger Middle East crisis? This is what everyone is deeply concerned about. So, we see, I call them the NERCs, North Korea, Iran, Russia, China. And they like this kind of weakness of the international system. They want to see a changing world order, and they're punching wherever they can. And Jake Sullivan, who's obviously a very accomplished person, just wrote a piece 1 week, I think, before the tensions exploded in the Middle East. So saying how great everything was in the Middle East, that it was nice and calm. So there are these kind of black swans. It's increasing, or some would say it's been a gray rhino running at us, all these tensions in the region. So I think that Iran is a real challenge for all of us in the region. And I think that we're seeing Russia and China kind of sitting back and watching how the West responds. The US, it grabs their attention. They have to use ships in the region. They're pushing their staff. These ships might be better off in the Asia-Pacific region. And there's a limited amount of munitions. So I think that this is a win-win for China, having these conflicts in the region. It disperses US attention. And all these problems, start to add up. We see munitions running down because of Ukraine. Budgets are limited because of, assistance to Ukraine. Now we have more problems in the Middle East. So I think this is a very positive development for China. They're opportunists. They didn't plan it, but they will try to use it to their advantage.
Thank you, Theresa. Andreas, about this question of climate diplomacy, and maybe I can jump in. Do you think that we are in, because let's face it, we just had last week the 2040 discussion and targets, and too ambitious or not. And it's quite astonishing is that that we don't, if we really want to save the planet, we don't think that, how can we engage the global actors, and actually that's one of the purpose of this, to have those. So are we doing enough? Should we have different strategy? More business focus? Andreas, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think that there is for sure a global synergy. Maybe it has been bigger in the last decades, but there is still.
Yeah.
But the best example to prove the question is, I met a very large investor in photovoltaic energy in Germany, and they are looking for they have already the place, but they have not the authorization yet. And recently he called me and he said, is it true that the European Commission is now putting duties on the Chinese photovoltaic elements? Because if you do so, we cannot pay for that, what we want to invest in Germany in that specific area. And so what does it mean now, climate diplomacy? I mean, for sure we have in our relations to China, think about climate, and that would, the short conclusion would say, then we have not to do any duties, because the cheaper we get the photosolar elements, the more they will be invested in Europe. But if we get dependent from them, we will have a problem in the long run. So the climate diplomacy would maybe mean in that moment that we have to accept higher prices for climate changing technologies at that moment, to be able to outline and to roll out at a later stage them in a more independent manner. So I'm sorry that it's more a question to you than an answer. I think it's extremely complicated to say today what for the European Commission climate diplomacy can really mean. I believe the best what we can do still, that I was a bit generic, but is to look for countries and societies that share with us the willingness to have freedom as a basic value, so that people think independently about our common future. And on that basis, it's still the best to move on, because they want then to invest in the better technologies on a fair level. And that's unfortunately not the case with some specific countries that have been mentioned here, without touching other elephants in the room. I think it's extremely complicated. And I think having a diplomacy at EU level that only focuses on climate would be wrong. I think the only focus, the first level that we have to focus on, is freedom as the basic value in the world. And after having achieved a good result on this, we can outline other stuff.
Thank you, Andreas. Theresa, you wanted to come in?
Just a quick second thing about climate. I was just recently at NATO, and they had an event about climate, and which I was happy to see, really honored to see how, and to speak about Russia, China, and climate. So I focus on the Arctic. And the number one thing that can contribute to climate change is war. So the whole idea is to avoid war, because that's really catastrophic for the climate. And second, as we see climate change and the opening of the northern route, China calls it the polar route. China describes themselves as a near-polar actor. So they're about 900 kilometers away from the northernmost point of China, but they see themselves as an Arctic player. The dynamic between Russia and China, as Russia becomes weaker, China can ask for things from them that they could never ask for before. They want cooperation. Russia has lots of bases in the Arctic. They see that as really key to their security. So China's asking for more access to these bases, because Russia's weak now and they're not in a position to say no. And they're also asking for more advanced technologies for silent submarines and more advanced missile technology that Russia has been holding back and not wanting to sell to China. But because of the situation with the war in Ukraine, China benefits from this, and Russia will everyone's watching very carefully and closely to see if this technology will be transferred to China, which will also have a big impact.
Thank you, Theresa. Christina, I would like to go back to Taiwan and also the domestic aspect. You just had elections, a new president, so a lot of more tension maybe was added to relations. So first of all, what is the relation between, in short, domestic politics in Taiwan now vis-a-vis the whole situation, and maybe with some words about the sentiment now in Taiwan, because of course, you know, if we are speaking about looming war, it needs to be huge stress on population. So if there's some minutes left, so if you can shortly comment on that.
So the recent election shows, first of all, that in terms of the president, the DPP still won, so Lai Ching-te became the president, and but then in terms of the legislature, it was not the DPP majority. So I think that shows the message. First of all, for Taiwan people, that they still. They're not really threatened by China, because China does not want DPP to become the president and the majority. So Taiwanese people show that they have their will, that they are not threatened by China. They cast their votes, depend on their own desire and who they want to vote for. And secondly, I think for China, having a divided, executive and the legislative, kind of gave them some relief, because that meant they can still play this so-called two-pronged strategy, which CCP has been known for, meaning that it can, give the carrots and the sticks at the same time. So what I'm saying is that for China, I think they will continue to try to use the carrots strategy to court the Taiwanese people, because the outcomes seem to give them the hope that, okay, it's not the continuation of the DPP majority in the legislative. But then at the same time, they're still continuing on with the pressure, the military and the hybrid warfare pressure on Taiwan. And I think we will see intensification of this pressure from now, especially from now until May, which is the time when the new administration comes to office. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. We still have some minutes left. Shairee, your foreign minister, Mr. Jaishankar, had, when this whole situation, war in Ukraine came up, and there was expectation vis-a-vis India, there was some quite strong pushback there verbally. So my question is to you, what would be, looking the debate, because you have been 2 years in this Brussels bubble, so you know the discussion. So what would be like the Indian advice? You see where we want to go, but what would be your advice to us Europeans? How to deal with this whole approach to global sphere, in short?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Tomi. I would say that, of course, Europe is very concerned about what is happening in Ukraine, and rightfully so, understandably so. But at the same time, I feel like it would be helpful for Europe to use this principled approach to also acknowledge hostilities and atrocities happening elsewhere in other parts of the world. As I mentioned earlier as well, India faces, an aggressive nuclear-armed China-Pakistan axis at its borders. And in 2020, when the Galwan Valley clashes happened, when China, brutally attacked India, infiltrated Indian territory, killed Indian soldiers, there wasn't so much of a whimper that came out of Brussels or other European capitals at the time. And Beijing is essentially, by its actions, trying to somewhat redraw the political map of the Himalayas. Yet in Europe, at that time in 2020, it was somewhat business as usual with Beijing. And it was only when China started behaving in less benign ways with Europe itself that Europe began to, rethink its approach to China. So I think my basic point and advice would be that when Europe is concerned about the future of the rules-based liberal order, it should also speak up when the rules are violated in other parts of the world. And I would say that's why Jaishankar's statement, which became quite famous when he said that, Europe must come out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. I think this is the reason that this statement found resonance in many countries in the world, but also in Europe, in fact. And Chancellor Olaf Scholz had actually repeated this statement in one of his addresses. The other point I would like to make is, when we talk about the rules-based global order, the question we need to ask ourselves is what sort of order this is, because in 2024, you still have global multilateral institutions that are non-inclusive, non-representative, non-equitable. So I think it's important to reform these institutions, because it is this failure to reform institutions, make them representative, that has somewhat made nations feel that the current order that is under attack is a Western-dominated order. It's not really a global order per se. So I think if Europe wants countries to have a stronger role in supporting this order, stabilizing this order, it needs to help in creating stakeholders who actually believe in sustaining this order. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Shairee. Good, clear remarks. We still have some minutes left, so I would kind of conclude. Theresa, you and me, we had a discussion about, the latest EU-Asia and ASEAN meeting. It took place 1 or 2 weeks ago. So maybe kind of one or two, within 1 or 2 minutes, 1 or 2 main takeaways just for us. What was your analysis on that? What this tells about our EU-Asia relation?
Okay, the EU-ASEAN meeting, I believe, took place on February 2nd. They managed to print a joint statement, and so they had a couple kerfuffles in the middle of the negotiations, but they were able to smooth these over, especially in regard to Indonesia. And there's a more nuanced relationship. The ASEAN members see a more nuanced relationship with China and also with Russia. And so, because China, for example, has done a great deal of investment in Indonesia, so Indonesia does not want to take a hard line on Beijing. So I think that the fact that the EU and ASEAN could come up with some sort of statement and improve relations, that's a key sign that EU is also a player in the region. Let's not forget that Europe is one of the biggest investors in ASEAN, also one of the biggest investors in Taiwan. So what happens in this region is key for Europe's future.
All right. Thanks, Theresa. And Andreas, I leave you the closing. So navigating a new era for great power politics. So for EU perspective, EU, as from the European Parliament, what is really the key issue, the key point, the key accent we must to focus on, in order to promote our vision?
Well, obviously, and the discussion, I think, has also shown this, our great power is our economy. So if we want to leverage what we have with the biggest market in the world, with the biggest free market in the world, we have to make sure that we set the right economic incentives, and that at the same time we make sure that they are respected by all countries, 27 member states, but also by the market operators. And we want to achieve this in a free way, that people can choose themselves. And this is a very complicated concept, because the more we legislate, the more we regulate, the less choice our operators have. And in some areas that we have been only briefly touching, also linked to climate diplomacy, we are all the time in an in-between situation. We cannot achieve both goals, but if we want to have a leverage in the world, we have to focus on our economic capacity, which is by far the highest tool that we have. And therefore, we have to choose the right way. Even sometimes it might be less popular and it might look contradictory, but we have only this tool that we really can use in difference to other countries like the US.
Exactly. All right, time is up. So I would propose I could give a big hand to our panelists. So thank you very much. And then I give floor to Theo. Theo, please.
Thank you, everyone, for following. Thank you again to all of our panelists for all of their insights. Thank you for all your questions, the short ones, the not so short ones. We'll be back here at 2:30, right after lunch, which will be hosted in the hallway right there. Thank you all.